Hey everyone, I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and welcome to the Groundwork Podcast. I don't know how many times I have to do that before I feel like I know what I'm doing, and I don't think I'm going to edit it out. I'm just going to let myself hang out there. I have just been on an exploration of all kinds of things lately, and one of my biggest explorations, and I have a solo cast that's going to really dig into this, has been around this concept of decentralization. When I look at what is happening within the cultural sphere, what I see is that a lot has been centralized. We have centralized regulations for how we process food and taken that away from small communities, oftentimes making it harder to produce awesome, regeneratively raised meat. We have centralized food in a way that has led to an abundance of hyper palatable processed foods owned by only a couple of companies that are deep into vertical integration with pharmaceutical companies, which I think makes a pretty difficult situation if they're incentivized for the food to make you sick and then they have the cure for that sickness. That does not feel like a hamster wheel I want to get into. And just been curious about the way I view some of local food as a way to really decentralize. It's not coming from Whole Foods. It's not coming from Safeway or Fry's or Aldi or all of these different things. It's actually like the land is being held by real people and the food is being grown by local people within your local system. And when you spend money within that system, they are then spending money also in that local economy. And I think there's a lot to be said for this concept of what it means to decentralize. And as I began really exploring decentralizing our food system, which never should have been centralized in the first place, right? I mean, that's kind of one of the big questions. It's like, well, why was this centralized in the first place? Decentralized currency naturally came up. And I think that there's something that's sort of percolating in the collective unconscious around this idea of decentralization. And so I started kind of asking some questions about Bitcoin and about alternative currency methods. And I'm still asking those questions. This is just a sticking our toes in the water of looking at the intersection of finance and food. It is what I am calling a sort of decentralization 101. And I'm going to state the obvious, which is, of course, I am not giving financial advice within the context of this podcast. This is all for you to research. And I think that, again, this is just kind of a first little foray into it. And I'm hoping to have some other guests on to sort of explore this and to just continue to look at this. And one of the things that I've talked a lot about within the context of sustainability is this idea that we talk so much about environmental sustainability or about health span and living, living our health out, right? Having a healthy body right up until when we die, as opposed to a lifespan, which right now often looks like getting sick and having your body begin to break down in your 60s, but still living into your 80s. And so as I think about some of these things, as I think about some of the ways that we are cultivating environmental sustainability or longevity in our health, we also have to be considering financial sustainability. And right now, I have no idea what that looks like or means. This podcast is an exploration and an exploration alone. But what I see within the agricultural model is that we are up against some really big hurdles. Scale is something that makes a lot of these businesses work because we're working on incredibly tight margins. You know, when I talk to farmers and ranchers, oftentimes we're looking at 1% to 3% margins across the board. That includes in places like butcher shops. I can attest to this as a butcher shop owner. And so scale becomes really important. And so does beginning to break down our financial and economic models and to explore what different models look like. And I think to this effect, this exploration of Bitcoin in particular and cryptocurrency, which we don't really get into, we just kind of stick to Bitcoin within this podcast, is really important, and exploring ideas like Charles Eisenstein's Sacred Economics, where he really breaks down what an entirely different system could look like. And so I think exploring all of these different avenues and trying to put them together and discover what makes sense or what's new or what's even just interesting to look at is really important to explore financial sustainability within environmentally sustainable models. And one of the things I was really curious about is just how does currency work? How did we get here? And so this is something that we really explore in a longer podcast, but this is an important one to me. How did we get here? And always for me, that question helps me understand where we are. And so we explore some of that on this podcast, and we explore some of the fascinating overlaps between Bitcoin and beef. And there are a lot of them. And it was interesting to sort of identify some pain points where things start to fall apart, both in finance and in health, as it's related to our consumption of animal meats. And so this was just a really fun exploration. Again, not advice. So, you know, keep your critical thinking and your autonomy with you. And I'm just really grateful that I got to go down this exploration with Tristan, and I hope that you all enjoy this fantastic podcast. I hope you all enjoy this fantastic podcast with Tristan Scott, who just wrote the fantastic book, Bitcoin and Beef. And I'm thinking about this episode as Decentralization 101, and I'm hoping that we get to some upper level classes in this. Hope everybody enjoys and that you're having a great day. If this podcast resonates, if it got your curiosity going, please share it on social media, leave us a review or a rating on iTunes or Spotify, and just thank you always for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I really do. So, hi, it's so great to have you here. I am just incredibly grateful that you're coming on the podcast and you're exploring something that I'm super curious about. I don't have a huge background in Bitcoin, but it's something my husband and I have been discussing. And so I'd love to know a little bit about your background before we sort of dig into Bitcoin and beef.
Absolutely, Kate. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to dig into, the topics of Bitcoin and beef and kind of a long form conversation. And my background definitely is a unique one. So how I kind of got into both areas of, decentralized finance and health, we can touch upon. So really, in terms of health, I was always kind of pretty healthy. My mom, she's of European descent, so dinners at home cooked meals, not really full of family full of soda or processed foods.
Awesome.
Was better than most. And I played a lot of sports growing up, always very active, so that was helpful. And I played soccer in college, which is kind of where the story starts. And always super active, but definitely health started to deteriorate in college, being an engineering student simultaneously as an athlete. But I sustained kind of one too many concussions, Most of them as a result of sport. The last one, not due to sport, but kind of pushed me over this threshold. Your brain does a really good job of compensating the issues for when you have, multiple brain injuries and concussions. And this is a huge area. So
TBIs, traumatic brain injury, things like that, I presume. And they come with a wild list of sort of integrated whole body symptoms.
Yeah, so if you've ever had a concussion, you may be familiar with some of these symptoms. Daily headaches, extreme fatigue, irritability, sensitivity to light, sound are big kind of main symptoms. And for me, this last one, I really didn't know I was concussed until a couple months later. And these symptoms basically persisted for an extremely long period of time, multiple months before I saw a neurologist. And then I kind of got the classic, just take it easy. Your brain will, figure out how to heal itself. You may not ever be back to your normal self, but the best thing to do is just take it easy and try to slowly get back in your routine. And at the time, it's really hard going from, a student athlete, engineering student, I'm definitely very go personality and get things done. And then all of a sudden I wasn't able to exercise, wasn't able to walk across campus without being extremely fatigued, was barely able to use, the only energy I had to just finish my coursework and at subpar, levels and make it through the semester, thankfully. But it was really, hard to hear that. And kind of eventually I just got fed up, and a year later or 9 to 12 months later, I still had most of these symptoms, daily headaches, because I wasn't doing anything different, so nothing was really getting better. And I decided to take it upon myself. Fortunately for me, because I have that kind of go-getter personality, I decided this wasn't acceptable. There had to be a way to get back to a better place, because even at that point, if I was, 10, 20% better, it would be a huge difference in my day-to-day life. And little did I know, how far I would go with that. So
you kind of took the tact of do your own research.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it's a lot, you're a lot more committed when, your entire life is, on the line. Your energy, your vitality, everything that you want to do, what you love to do is really on the line. So it was kind of a no-brainer decision for me in terms of committing everything I knew into reading books, diving into podcasts, YouTube videos. But, what I didn't know, and what most people don't know, is there's this absurd amount of free information or very low-cost information for healing, for health, and for optimizing your life. And that's so amazing. And kind of went down this rabbit hole, started listening to Ben Greenfield podcasts. For example, we talked about that before. It's a great starting place. Reading all the books, the YouTube channels, understanding how the brain works, how health works, what's wrong with our current diet, our current lifestyles. And like I said, I always had a somewhat healthier lifestyle probably than the average American, being very active and eating mostly, at least foods that I was cooking myself, not as processed, but still sometimes. And then, I decided to, overhaul my lifestyle, really focus on stress reduction, sleep quality, diet that is absolutely free of processed foods, and then slowly work in some modalities to help heal my brain. And, over a course of a couple months, I really made some strides and was able to get back into exercising. And then from there, my healing and my progress just kind of exponentially rose. And from there I was hooked. Once you have a life-changing experience in health, you owe everything to not only continue learning, but spread that education and knowledge to others. So that was about 3.5 years ago. And from there, I mean, my knowledge has just continued to increase. My lifestyle habits have continued to be fine-tuned, and I feel better now than I have ever in my life, which is fantastic. And, I never thought I would be in such a place. So it's been super rewarding, and I'm just super thankful that I stumbled upon such a fantastic community of knowledge.
Yeah, man, I feel the same way. I did a lot of my own research within that, and I healed myself, and I literally feel better than I ever have in my whole life, just through the work that I've done. And so I really understand that. And I know you even explored, and we can get into this later, but you explored carnivore diets, I think, for brain health. Is that correct?
So actually, I explored ketogenic diet first, and that
Makes
was
sense.
yeah, exactly. So I went down the keto rabbit hole. Basically, I read a lot about how having a low carb diet, highly restricted, so you can get very high ketone levels in the blood. It's very anti-inflammatory.
Just energy for your brain.
Yes, exactly, and that really helped a ton because we know that the glucose utilization of your brain is really a huge issue post TBI, post concussion, and sometimes there's just a threshold, right? Because obviously your brain is such a large user of glucose, uses the most per weight of
energy.
Of energy, exactly. So that's the biggest reason that you have all these fatigue issues when you have a concussion, and especially blood glucose spikes. Even if you're healthy and you have a large blood glucose spike, you get that, sign of fatigue. So when you're concussed and your brain is not optimally functioning, you have even more so of a detrimental effect. So I went on a strict ketogenic diet for about 4 months, and did not break it once. Like, I was super committed, and I felt fantastic, super level-headed. At that point, the headaches were kind of going away anyway, but that pretty much cleared out any daily headaches I had. My energy was super even keel and level, and it was fantastic. But I definitely now I don't practice such a strict ketogenic diet. I'm more strategic with my carb intake, post workout or at night. But I definitely still utilize that knowledge of carbohydrate glucose spikes to be productive. I'm not going to eat like a stack of pancakes or, have a lot of raw honey, which is where I get a lot of my carbs from for breakfast or lunch at work, because it's just not conducive to, productivity. And that's what I like, a lot. And I had that metabolic machinery, the ketogenic community calls it, to really use fat as an alternative energy source. So that was a big one for me, that helped a lot.
I love that. I feel very similarly. Carbs are for bedtime to help me wind down. I need a little bit more of a carbohydrate load because I'm a woman. Makes it a little bit different, but I feel really similarly. And then you're also an engineer. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I went to school. I have my master's in electrical engineering. So I currently work in the semiconductor industry. But yeah, that's a good transition to how I got into Bitcoin and crypto, because
Before we go there, I actually wonder if you'll play this thought experiment with me, because as I was preparing for this podcast, I had to think a lot about currency in a way that I hadn't really considered. Like, what is currency? Why do we have it in the first place? And how did we get here to this place where we're discussing alternative currencies? And as I was sitting at the breakfast table and talking with my husband about it, we were talking about, in a hunter-gatherer situation, and many tens of thousands of years ago, the main currency in many ways would have been food, that we are bartering beings by nature, to barter for things that we don't have, and to trade, maybe across tribes or even within tribes. And so I just think it's really interesting, food as currency, or at least the impetus for that first currency where you need food. And I recently did a podcast where we discussed salt and the history of salt, which has been, through multiple points in history, been used as currency. I mean, that's where the word salary comes from. It's how Roman soldiers were paid, was in salt, because it is necessary for life. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about this sort of genesis of currency.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, there's so much connection between our food system and monetary systems, as we're going to talk a lot about. But what's interesting is for the longest time, people, used whatever was, in demand as a currency, and they could trade. So yeah, definitely a lot of bartering, a lot of trading going on. Someone has, meat, someone has fruit, someone has just, shoes, clothing, definitely was traded. But the problem with using food and items as currency is you hit a point where you may want fruit from me, but I don't want meat from you. And then, okay, maybe you can bring in a third party to kind of, they want the meat from you, and they're willing to be the middleman, and that. But that's kind of where the origin of currency came from, and that characteristic of money is extremely important, or else you can't really use everyday commodities for currency, and that's the reason.
We need
but
a
it probably took a long
means,
time.
Universal means of exchange. Yeah.
But it probably took a long time for that to happen, which is really interesting. And overall, I think that's always been extremely connected between the food and financial systems, because that's the most important means of money is to purchase things so you can survive on a daily basis. And I think people are realizing that again more and more today with the supply chain crises. But the history of money goes back very, very far, and using things, first food and goods, to some common scarce item, maybe seashells, or some, of course, any metal was used in very many traditional or ancient societies. And that's kind of where it all starts. And it all starts with scarcity and how difficult it is to increase that supply of money. Because if you're using, for example, seashells on an island for currency, because that is something that, maybe a specific seashell is rare on that island, but the next island over has, an abundant amount of these seashells. They have a ship. They could come to your island and crash your economy. Very, very quickly. So that's the problem with a lot of money or currencies that were used in the past. That's a problem with a lot of the less difficult to produce metals, such as copper or even silver, is that, to a certain extent, once technology had advanced enough, it's pretty easy to expand the copper supply. It's also easy to manipulate copper from a chemical structure standpoint, and that's why all these, so they would kind of taint, their coins. They would say maybe it's silver, and then they cut it with copper or other inferior metals that were cheaper to make. And that's kind of how they used to debase their currency back in the day. They didn't have, necessarily, a digital money printer like we do today. So they had to get creative in terms of, chemically altering it from a cost perspective, but then still using it to hold the theoretical same value. And that's how all roads pointed to gold, because gold is the hardest to, extract of all the precious metals. But it's also the most chemically stable. So, that's why it's very popular for jewelry, because, 100, 500 years, gold is still going to be, hold its structure chemically and not erode or corrode like other metals can. So that's really why gold became, the standard for currency or the what backed currencies. Is because it's chemically viable. It's hard to, produce on a moment's notice more. And that is why it's, the standard for currency. And it still is the hardest money physically that we probably have in the world. But of course, now we have a new player in the game.
Yes, and I want to get to that new player, but first, and I love that you brought that in, because I was actually my husband and I went into some deep thought experiments on what determines value, and so you kind of explaining the value of gold within the lens of the monetary system, that was really helpful for me, and I think in that same way. So, and I know that a lot of my listeners are very familiar with regenerative agriculture. But I think oftentimes whenever we're explaining a new concept, it's good to explain the system or the paradigm, the old paradigm, right? So if Bitcoin is our new paradigm, there's this old paradigm of how currency currently operates. And I'm just curious, and I think especially right now, and I mean, as we're doing this, it has not been a good week for the market, for Bitcoin, for inflation. It's been a pretty wild ride right in the middle of June. If you could explain how our current currency system functions.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a historical week, so don't underplay that. With the highest interest rate hike since 1994, yes. And we could be technically in the midst of watching the very decline of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency.
I think we are.
So it's really crazy. I was talking about it with coworkers this week. I'm actually excited to see how this all plays out. But yeah, for a history, the current currency system is it's a complex one, because it's been dynamically changing kind of by the decade on what policy is. But in order to understand what we do, maybe nowadays, you have to go back and understand what happened before that, and before the 1900s, really the turn of the century, where this all kind of changed. And I talked about earlier how all roads kind of pointed to gold as, the standard for being the most sound currency, the most sound money. And that's because it's chemically, it's difficult to alter. If you do want to increase the supply, it's very expensive, so it's not really worth it. In contrast, if you wanted to rapidly increase the supply of copper or silver, you could do that. So you could easily corner the market and then create a giant bubble, which has happened many times in the past. So we know that's the downside of both silver and copper as currencies, or as what's backing the currency. So gold kind of was the standard, and the gold standard, what it was is that central banks of large countries, large global economic powers, they would hold gold in their central banks as the country's currency, and for hundreds of years, other countries still held silver. China was on silver for a long period of time, and that kind of bit them in the butt eventually. But overall, they would use these metals as their form of currency to fund economic actions in their country and then internationally. But there was the introduction of fiat currencies, which is kind of a paper or a physical note that holds the worth in the gold that is sitting in the central bank. So it's kind of a paper receipt, or an IOU. So that definitely started kind of in Europe as the industrialization of the world, and colonization actually before the industrialization. So with the Dutch East India Trading Company being really kind of the first major player on the world scene, taking over many trade routes in the East Indies, exploring other countries, exploring the Americas, of course. So it's really inefficient to trade in gold on a global scale, especially in high quantities. Gold's pretty heavy, it's hard to transport around, and there's this constant where is the central holdings of the gold. So the introduction of these paper receipts or fiat currencies was made sense. But for a long time, these paper receipts or fiat currencies were just this is backed by gold, 100%. We're not printing or creating more of this fiat currency, this paper receipt of what we have in gold. So it's totally pegged to the amount of gold that you have as a country. And basically what happened is, there would be a lot of loaning going on, and, countries found it pretty easy to, extrapolate more paper receipts or more of their fiat currency than they did actually have gold. So basically lending out more than they actually had. And that would ultimately lead to the demise of, the Dutch as the global economic power, and see, the next player rise to the top, which was, Great Britain for a while. So they have their own trading company. They have the British Empire, which, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It's so vast. And people actually said that about the Dutch Empire as well. So, but then the same thing kind of happened to Great Britain. So they were pegged to gold. They had X amount of gold in their central banks, and accumulated that through trade, through successful battles and wars across Europe and across the world. And that's how, countries got more gold. And really before, the 1900s, there was a lot of wars, but really there was less absolute wars, because countries would easily just run out of money. They didn't have, that ability to just print more money and actually like keep going in the war, fight useless wars. These were pretty, substantial wars for territory in their empires. But oftentimes,
and you have a finite resource. I mean, gold, and a finite capacity for extracting that resource, and so there's a limit.
Yes, exactly. And the history of all these, revolutions and dynamics within different empires is really deep, and I highly recommend checking it out on a deeper level. But overall, that's kind of how things worked. And then, we came around to the early 1900s, and there's some conflict rising in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, with the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and World War I is beginning. And at this point, Great Britain is kind of the world economic power, the world reserve currency, the sterling or the pound. And they really joined a war that they didn't have to get involved in. And it was a poor decision, looking back, for them to get involved in this war. And in order to pay for it, they basically created a lot of debt that they were hoping their country, their citizens, would be willing to pay for. But in reality, they weren't, because they didn't feel as though they needed to join this war. And because of that decision and funding this war and getting involved in that, they could no longer had the resources, the gold, the money, to actually be pegged, the pound be pegged to their gold at this fixed rate of what it was. So they went off the gold standard. They had to, and that kind of set the scene for the whole century. And we saw the decline of Great Britain, and this large conflict in Europe continue to World War I happened, and then some poor decisions were made post-World War I that set the scene for World War II. And at this time, the United States is a rising global economic power. And after World War II, they had, the most amount of gold of any nation, and had a gold standard. And at the Bretton Woods Conference, was decided that the United States dollar would become the global reserve currency. So this was, great for the United States. But now kind of people and central bankers understood that it was possible to really, mess with your currency and basically print money to fund things that you really wanted to pursue at whim. And this was now known and really set the scene going forward. So for a while, the U.S. was taking advantage of that. And this is where, Keynesian economics kind of plays the role, that the government should intervene. They should create, increase the money supply during an economic downturn to increase, this consumer spending, and basically just an interventionist form of economic thought. So this kind of was now the, accepted economic protocol, and that was practiced by the United States up until the 70s, when in 1971, basically everyone's calling the U.S. bluff of, lending out their money and actually not having, they printed more money than they had in their gold reserves. So if everyone goes to redeem that paper receipt all at once, then you're going to be insolvent. And that's exactly what happened to the United States in 1970, 1971. And Nixon had to take us off the gold standard. So that was, the huge mark in huge change in how we operate monetary policy. And since then, that whole decade was a mess with stagflation, high inflation up to, 20% roughly. And interest rates had to be, risen to around that same rate, 20%, to combat that inflation. And that kind of just set the scene on how we handle monetary policy now. But once you do that, you're really just setting a timeline or a stopwatch for how long you can last as a currency, because once that connection
as the global reserve currency.
Yes. And once that connection is broken, once Great Britain decided to make that decision in the early 1900s and enter World War I, their time as a global reserve currency was also, finite. So I think that's the same that goes for the US dollar. We kind of made it through the 80s and 90s, and then we had this, huge run-up .com bubble, and had to, enact more interventional policies then. And then, of course, we have the 2008 economic crisis. And that brought us to having artificially low interest rates, because now we've just accumulated so much debt. So if you look at the debt of the United States is crazy, and the debt to GDP ratio over triple digits. So now 2022, we're here. We've had artificially low interest rates for the past decade because of what happened in the past. And then we have COVID shut down everything, locked down everything. So once interest rates are a knob to turn that you can't turn anymore because they're already at 0 or less than 1%, and they're negative real interest rates, which means countries that are holding the US dollar are getting a negative real interest rate. And that's how this all works. Basically, as the global reserve currency, countries are just buying the US dollar as a form of debt, but in reality, they're getting a negative real interest rate to hold it. So it's not a system that's functioning.
It's not
properly.
sustainable. Not sustainable.
Exactly. And now we had the lockdowns, and the only thing we could do to stimulate economic growth or just economic recovery in a lockdown, which is questionable whether we should have, of course, but that doesn't even matter because it's over now. And we expanded the money supply 40-50% since 2020, because that was the only thing they could do, because interest rates were already extremely low or at 0. And now we're here in 2022 with the expected, pretty much double-digit rates of inflation. And the only thing they can do is raise interest rates. But why I'm saying this is so exciting to see play out is that, in the 70s, late 70s, 1980, we had to raise interest rates to, almost 20% to combat the inflation. Right now, we have so much debt that if we raise them to a certain point, we're basically bankrupting, the many corporations and the US dollar. And this holds true for Japan. The yen, the euro is also in a similar situation where we actually can't raise the rates that high because we have such a fine balance between the amount of debt we have, and it can easily cause a default on the currency again and make us go bankrupt. So Yeah, I'm excited to see how this plays out, but that's kind of you know how the currency works today. The global trade is denominated in US dollar. It's kind of agreed upon since the Bretton Woods conference. But right now is probably the most fragile it's been, and it's probably only going to accelerate
across the globe. I mean, I think not just instability in the dollar, but instability across multiple different global currencies in a situation where you have a high level of connectedness throughout the globe in how we trade goods and the way that goods make their way around the world and to feed and clothe and furniture, and more, an entire global populace, and so that was beautiful. By the way, I learned so much just then, and I needed to like set the scene.
No,
how does this work?
I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer, so hopefully that was understandable. But for me, you know, what is the biggest takeaway as we went through this history is that the supply of the money is infinite. Right. And then once you get along this train of having it actually backed by nothing, and you start to increase the supply regularly and you start to play around with the interest rates, but now your debt is so high that you can't actually raise the rates so much. You're cornered into a situation that you almost are going to go down the path of potential hyperinflation, or at least regularly high levels of inflation. So scarcity, extreme addition to this money supply is a regular expectation now, and scarcity is non-existent. So that's the most important quality and thing to remember, I think.
Yeah, and I think on this current economic model, and we can kind of point, you know, after the industrial and the scientific revolution 350 years ago, we kind of go into the modern economic model, maybe not the currency model, but this, you know, Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations, you have Keynes and these players that are kind of making these sciences of economics. And one thing that I was actually talking about in a podcast that I recorded yesterday is this sort of Cartesian reductionist thinking of getting into, you know, breaking everything down into its component parts, when I think in many ways the financial system is an ecosystem. And I pulled this quote from this book I've been reading because I thought it was an interesting way of looking at this. And I mean, the idea during that time was that you could just have slow, steady economic growth in perpetuity, that we would just slowly and steadily continue to rise. But the mathematics of the time, you know, these Newtonian dynamics weren't actually accounting for friction. And all of the economic model was modeled after this Newtonian
ideal,
you know, Cartesian. It's ideal. Yeah. It's an ideal. It's a utopia. And they're missing this idea of friction within the markets. And I just think it's really interesting. I agree with you that it's really interesting to be in this time here now and to see what's happening and to wonder what comes next, which I think leads us right into cryptocurrency and into Bitcoin and what role it might play in the future of our currency system. And so do you want to just dive into kind of breaking down Bitcoin for people?
Yeah. And before that, just what you said there is extremely important, right? These are all like ideal scenarios where, you know, wars, really military conflict, you know, agriculture, disasters from maybe natural disasters. These things are never taken into account maybe in ideal models. And that's why they don't work, because ideally, as you know, a currency, you might want to increase the money supply by just a couple percent each year to just encourage constant growth over a long period of time. And that's basically what gold is, right? The supply of gold increases by just a couple percentage points each year, and it's been pretty stable over the last few hundred years, and that's why it is you know, the hardest physical form of money. But that doesn't work with fiat currencies when there's a lot of conflict and you know, things that can go wrong, friction, like you said. So I think that's a great point to add. But yeah, Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin and why is it different? And cryptocurrency, that's a whole other sphere. But But in general, I do, I focus only on Bitcoin in this book because although Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency, now there are thousands of them, but none of them are like Bitcoin and none of them ever will be because of the fundamentals of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin network. And that's an important point to start with. But overall, what is Bitcoin? How does it work? What is the advantage of, a digital currency and one that's fully decentralized, which is extremely important characteristic is, Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer electronic cash payment system as outlined in the white paper, which you can easily download online. You just Google Bitcoin white paper and it has,
we'll post a link
good
to that
summary. Yeah. It's really, everyone should read it. But there's a lot of technical information as well in there that you might not understand. But that's kind of like the first lines. And basically, to understand what Bitcoin is from, an everyday use perspective or just in general, how it can benefit you is what is it similar to? So you might hear, peer-to-peer electronic cash, but like, oh, we already have that. We already have Venmo, PayPal, Zelle now, and these are becoming extremely popular. And they're convenient, right? But they aren't actually peer-to-peer. So what peer-to-peer or how those function is that, if I want to Venmo you, Kate, it might seem like it's just going between me and you, but there's a lot of financial institutions that are involved in this transaction. So in order for me to Venmo you, I have to have an account at a financial institution and be in good standing with that account, have regular money, and then I set up my Venmo account. I need to have sufficient funds, and then I can send you money, and then you have to have, I guess you could technically have it just on the app, but then you wouldn't be able to use it really. So typically you would have your financial account linked to your Venmo account, and then you would transfer it back into that account. And that whole process, of clearing and sending, although it's instantaneous in terms of the app, it actually takes a few days to fully clear and fully process. But in reality, that money I'm sending you, I don't own that money. I don't actually physically know where that money is. It's just, accounting on my financial institution's end. And in reality, they're the ones who own it. They hold my money. I am trusting them to, do good by my financial account. So it's not peer-to-peer. It's a third-party system, and that third party is the bank. And that third party has all the leverage, and that's why they can get away with a lot of the negative things that people associate with banks, poor customer service, freezing your bank account, charging an exorbitant amount of fees for, using the ATM, overdraft, withdrawal fees, trading fees, financial advising fees, investment fees. That's their whole business model is fees.
And they make money.
They make most of their money off of fees. So it's if you go to the Bank of America, I guess just like annual report, it's crazy. I think I have it written down here. Is they make at Bank of America in 2020 made $7 billion in investment banking fees, and overall 34 to 35 billion in fees or commission to that. And that's 40% of their annual revenues is coming from fees. But, you could argue, that's the service. You're entrusting someone to hold your money, and it's safe. It's backed by FDIC insurance. But in reality, if every single person went, like if you had a good amount of money and if you just wanted to go to the bank and pull out like $100,000, they would never let you do that.
You can't do that.
It would be so hard because in reality, they're totally insolvent. It's the fractional reserve banking system. They loan out most of the money. So that's how that works. And it's similar to, how our currency works is you give them your money, they pay you an absolutely garbage interest rate, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if that counts.
And it's literally it's nothing today. And then they loan it out to someone else for, you know, a mortgage loan or a car loan or whatever for actual, you know, 5 to 20%. So they're making money on that. But in reality, they don't have all the money that they're, you know, are in the bank accounts of their holders. So it is really, it's just giant shuffling of money around. So a lot of people have seen how that can, you know, play out. And in 08, 09, we saw the insolvency crisis of some of these large banks. And yeah, it doesn't matter if...
We saw the willingness of the government to take big leaps to intervene.
Yes. Yeah. And they really have to. But yeah, your money really is not that safe in the actual grand scheme of things. But regardless, what is Bitcoin? Why is it different? Because it's actually a peer-to-peer network of money, of digital money. And if I have Bitcoin, I hold the private keys. I own it. It's not on the exchange that you bought it from or wherever you got it from. I can send it to you directly. It's my Bitcoin. I own it. I'm sending it to you in 10 minutes. It'll be confirmed, at least partially, on the blockchain. Then you will receive that in your digital wallet, and you will own it. There's no middleman of a third party, because the middleman is actually the network, the Bitcoin network. So to backtrack, that's kind of the main functionality of, you know, how people transact with Bitcoin, and why it's different is because you actually own it, you hold it. If you hold the private keys and not using a custodian or an exchange where you bought it, which is actually a very important thing to understand. And now we've seen actually in the past couple of weeks why that's even more important, because we're having, you know, a solvency crisis within the crypto community, and people are learning that the hard way.
Yes.
But either way, that's how it functions. That's the advantage, is that you physically own the Bitcoin. You are responsible for it. Therefore, so it does come with increased responsibility, but you have the ownership of it. And nobody can take that away from you, and you have direct control of how that's operating. There's no company, there's no CEO of Bitcoin. So it's important to understand how it works, because if you mess up a transaction, that's on you. But
and it's gone.
It gives you, potentially it's gone forever.
Yeah.
So that's how how it works when you want increased liberty with your financial with your money. So yeah, Bitcoin it's not a company. It was created anonymously.
Perfect. That was my next question.
Yeah, by someone under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008, 2009. And we don't know who it is. If it's one person, male or female, if it's a group of people, we have no idea. But that is actually the craziest part about Bitcoin. And it's actually, people argue whether that's really important to the decentralization aspect. I think it certainly is. But yeah, to this day, there's not, in a modern society where everything is leaked, everything is known, it's extremely impressive how literally nobody knows. I mean, maybe like 10 people on the earth know. I have no idea. So
yeah,
it's really
and
cool.
I think there's arguments both ways, that increases its trustworthiness, and that obfuscation actually creates some doubt in its trustworthiness. Yeah.
But why is that important? Because actually the Genesis wallet, or the wallet that only Satoshi would have access to, which we don't even know if he does or she does or they do, this group of people or this individual, they could be dead. They could have thrown the keys, that information to this wallet in the ocean. Who knows? We don't know. But what's incredible is that, there's like billions of dollars in this wallet, and it hasn't moved.
Nope.
And we know that because the Bitcoin network, you can actually map the transactional data. So how does the Bitcoin network work? And it's always explained as a distributed ledger, which, to be honest, when I first started, I have no idea what that means. So the way I like to think about it, or at least I explain in the book, is it's kind of like a shared Google spreadsheet, right? And ledgers are also often compared to spreadsheets. And this Google sheet, for example, everybody in the world has access to it. So it's way more transparent than you think. And this is also what I write about in terms of criminal use. It's funny when, politicians are slamming it for criminal use, because it's actually, and the FBI has confirmed that it's actually easier to track criminals when they use Bitcoin, because they can track down the transactional history compared to cash, for example. But either way, this is a shared Google sheet or spreadsheet. And each sheet is kind of, can be called like a block. And these blocks are released every 10 minutes into circulation, and each block has X amount of Bitcoin as a reward for these miners that are mining Bitcoin. But why are they doing this, and how does that play into the transactional piece? So when you send a transaction on the Bitcoin network, it gets transcribed in a block. So each block has, hundreds of transactional information. And in order to verify that, so think of the third party earlier, right? Your bank is the third party. The Bitcoin network is the third party in this situation. And in each block, there's all these transactions, and they need to be verified in order to go through that, Tristan has X amount of Bitcoin in his digital wallet, which has a specific address, and then he's sending that to Kate digital wallet, which there's no names attached to this. It's just, alphanumeric characters. And that needs to be verified by someone, right? It can't just be a trustless situation. So that's where the network comes in, and it's verified by the network. But in order to incentivize people or anyone to verify it, and how it's verified is with computational power or computational electrical hardware. So what people know is Bitcoin mining, right? That's how Bitcoin is released into circulation. So in order to incentivize the verification of these transactions, Satoshi set up the network so that each block has a reward of Bitcoin for verifying these transactions. And in order to verify and get this potential reward of Bitcoin, you need to solve complex algorithms, mathematical algorithms, to get this reward or fight for a piece of the reward. And therefore, you're also simultaneously verifying this transactional data. So in the beginning, you could do this with a very small piece of hardware, your computer, your Xbox, whatever, because the overall usage of the network was very low. The price of Bitcoin was very low, of course, as well. The adoption overall was very low. So fast forward to today, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry of Bitcoin mining, and the mining difficulty has therefore increased a very large amount, and these miners are using extremely expensive pieces of hardware to solve these complex algorithms faster than someone who has an inferior piece of hardware. So that's why you technically could mine something with your computer, but you're never going to get like anything in terms of reward from the block, because you just don't have the computational power, the hardware to solve those algorithms fast enough. So that's why this has become such an exponential rise. But either way, these miners are verifying the transactional data. They're competing to do this, so it's a competition. And then in turn, they're verifying the data. Your transaction goes through on the network. Every 10 minutes, there's a block. So back to the spreadsheet analogy, this block is like one cell in the spreadsheet, and each cell or each block is every 10 minutes being verified by the mining network. And therefore there's X amount of Bitcoin that's released into circulation, new Bitcoin that has never been released, and that goes to the miners for verifying your transactions. Then the next block, it moves to the next block. The difference between a spreadsheet and the Bitcoin network is that it's sequential, and that's where the name blockchain comes, because one block after another, it just forms a chain of sequential blocks. And why it's so important to know that is you cannot just go and change, block number 10 if you're on block number 25 now, because in order to do that, because it's sequential, you need to go and undo blocks 25 through 10 in order to change block 10. And in order to do that, now the computational hardware that would be required to do that, the mining power, would be so immense that it's pretty much impossible to do that. Because not only, and that's why the Bitcoin network is so secure, because it's extremely difficult to undo a block. And this is called a proof of work system. So the work is the algorithms, the work done by the hardware to solve these and verify the transactions. And in order to do this work, you get rewarded in Bitcoin, but in order to undo it, it's extremely difficult. So that's kind of how it functions. It's a dynamic, sequential, spreadsheet that holds this transactional information that incentivizes competition amongst miners to therefore get rewarded in Bitcoin. And that's how it secures the network, both from, hackability standpoint and also a verification standpoint of the transactions. So I know that's a lot of information, but that's kind of how it works. And then maybe next we could go into why would they want to be rewarded in Bitcoin? What is so different about the fundamentals? But
let's do it. No, please go on.
Any questions there?
No, I think that's such a beautiful overview. And I think that one of the most difficult things about having this conversation around Bitcoin is that there are so many of us that don't even really understand the system, the methodology that's underlying this new idea of currency, which makes it feel even more difficult to wrap your head around. And
that's a great point. And I want to make that clear, is that's literally why I wrote this book, is because both Bitcoin, the monetary system, food system, health, nutrition, farming, these are all extremely technical topics. And the reason why the everyday individual does not understand these topics is because they're extremely technical. Yeah. But the mainstream media often has, journalists reporting, sensationalist headlines, debasing the credibility of, Bitcoin and beef, when they don't really understand how these systems function at even a high level. So I wanted to write this book. Chapter 1 is literally called What is Bitcoin? And a lot of the things I'm saying right now is covered in chapter 1. And same thing, chapter 2 is outlining, our food system, chronic disease. Why does this stuff matter? How did we get here? Because this stuff is very hard to wrap your head around if you don't have your toes at least in the water. And even then, it's you could go so deep to where it's really people spending their entire lives researching this. And I'm not that person. I'm not the most expertise view on either Bitcoin or the food system and health. I have an engineering background. I've wrote research papers to get my master's degree. So I have an understanding of technical information, reading research, and extrapolating from there. And being an engineer, electrical, I understand, the grid, the power dynamics, and just more, technical information at a high level. But I'm not an expert either. So I wanted to write this so people can understand what's important to take away. And you can see, even just explaining to someone how Bitcoin works is pretty challenging. And most people know what it is. They've heard of it, but they don't really know what it is. They don't really understand the fundamentals. And that's what's the key here. It's the fundamentals. Why is it different?
I mean, through the lens of this podcast, we're always kind of exploring what it means to lay the groundwork, what it means to build that foundational, fundamental knowledge of any given thing where you can then go from there. And I mean, it's also meant in this concept of laying the groundwork for generations to come, that what we do now within our financial system, within our agricultural system, is going to have far-reaching effects into future generations. And there's kind of this idea of how do we care for a child 100 years before it's born, or even more. And I think that there really are a lot of intersecting considerations here between Bitcoin and a regenerative farming model. And maybe now is actually a good time to kind of maybe begin to put them together, and then we can dive into some deeper questions around Bitcoin towards the end.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
Just at a high level, it sounds great. But the reason why Bitcoin is different, and we kind of set the scene there, was it's scarce. It's the most scarce form of money. So this whole situation for miners being rewarded by verifying the transactional data for you to send Bitcoin across the network is how it functions. Why do they want to be rewarded in Bitcoin? Why do people want to send it? Is because there's 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be created. That is a finite number. That code cannot be changed, and that is scarcity to the definition. And
Yes.
Right now we have about 19 million Bitcoin in circulation. So this started being mined, just over a decade ago. And, the majority was put into circulation. As you can see, 19 million out of 21 million, we're, 90% almost of the way there. And, the thing is, every 4 years or so, the amount that gets put in circulation on a daily basis, on a 10-minute basis, will be cut in half. So that reward for the miners will continue to decrease around every 4 years, therefore making it even more scarce. And that annual inflation rate of Bitcoin will continue to drop. So right now it's a little bit above the overall growth rate or inflation rate of gold. It's like a couple percent, but every 4 years it'll continue to be cut in half. So actually, although we're at 19 million Bitcoin right now, the 21 millionth Bitcoin won't be mined for, I think, another 100 years or so. And that's digital scarcity. There's 7 billion people on the planet. There's only 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist. You can do the math. That's not even enough to sustain the amount of millionaires there are currently in the world. So if you hold just one Bitcoin, so you can see how the potential for growth, and in a world where inflation is rampant currently, this is what it was made for. This was made coming out of the '08 recession, realizing this faulty monetary policy, providing an alternative that is native to the internet, native to the digital age that we now live in. So that is where the true value is in the scarcity of the asset.
Yeah, and that it has this finite cap, that there is no amount of you can't quantitatively ease Bitcoin and print more or mine more of it. And one thing I really wanted to make sure that we captured is this decentralized nature of how mining works. And if you could just touch on that so that we have that picture going into this conversation between farming and Bitcoin.
Yeah, so overall, that's why it's decentralized. So there's no central computer of this. It's a network of computers or computational hardware that is mining the Bitcoin added into circulation. There's also no company. There's no CEO. Like I said, there's no customer service. So it's fully decentralized. And from a mining perspective, there has been a lot of criticism around, for a while there was a large, cluster of miners in China that had, a large amount of the mining power, or what's called the hash rate of the network. And since then, China has, outlawed mining, and there is some truth to that, but still they don't even come close to having enough mining power to fully, have any control over the network or hack the network, for example. And since then, it's only become more decentralized because there's more and more adoption. There's more people who want to get into mining. So overall, it's decentralized because there is not a central mining hub. Anybody can mine Bitcoin, and anybody can verify. You could actually just verify transactions with an even smaller piece of hardware. You won't get rewarded in Bitcoin really, but you'll be just verifying transactions. And there's over, 10,000 what's called nodes. And these Bitcoin nodes are all verifying transactions, and the miners are totally, spread out throughout the world, although there is large clusters of, large mining groups. Overall, it's extremely decentralized because there's no one central entity. There's no central bank of Bitcoin. There's no central mining company of Bitcoin. It's a collective effort. And the more adoption there is over the coming years, remember this is, just over a decade old. It's extremely new technology still.
Yeah.
The more dispersed that will be. And it's still very nascent technology, but that fundamental decentralization that's programmed into the network is what really separates it. And there's nothing you can change about that. That's the beauty of it. If you want to be part of the decentralization and the network, you can hop on board. That's what's so cool about it. It's open source, and it's really empowering the individual.
I love that. And I think that this concept of decentralization is really critical to how we consider how we do prepare for these generations going forward and what we do want our lives to look like. I actually pulled this quote from a book on ecology about what a network is, because it sounded a lot to me like Bitcoin, and I'm going to read it. I like quotes. In other
Absolutely.
words, the web of life consists of networks within networks. At each scale, under closer scrutiny, the nodes of the network reveal themselves as smaller networks. We tend to arrange these systems, all nesting within larger systems, in a hierarchical scheme by placing the larger systems above the smaller ones in a pyramid fashion. But this is a human projection. In nature, there is no above or below, and there are no hierarchies. There are only networks nesting within other networks.
That's so true. And that's very true, right? Because we like to layer things in hierarchies, and there's always someone in charge at the top, I guess is what's really important, right?
Yeah.
But Bitcoin, there's no one in charge.
It's human nature. And I think it is especially human nature within the paradigm of this mechanistic and sort of reductionist view that we see that break at Rene Descartes. And we also see this break. I was actually just reading this book where we see a break in cyclicality, which we see mirrored in nature, whether that's the seasons or the lunar cycles or life and death, into an idea of linear thinking. And really, when we get into this idea of how we move about in nature, there's nothing linear about nature. And so I think there's some interesting correlations there between networks and between sort of non-linear styles of thinking about currency. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, overall it's thinking outside the box, right? I mean, the problem with scientific research, and this is where I think we start getting into the overlapping, in every industry is the problem with research and how we do things nowadays, or the environment of thinking has become so narrowed down to this sphere of academia, and really the only people who are doing research in academia are just furthering, what's the current knowledge. But in order to make any progress, you have to totally step outside this box.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that there's no one to tie Bitcoin to, like an economist or a government entity, is what makes it so powerful, because you can't there's no bias. There's no groupthink. There's none of this garbage. Biases because they're left or right, or they're from this institution, or they're holistic, or they're traditional. It's just, this is it. And, you can't weigh it down with that kind of negativity. It's free.
It's decentralized in terms of a thought process too. I mean, it's not just that it's not coming from one binary or another, that it is really just the process of the people that are interacting with that system, with the system of Bitcoin, that it's this sort of, I mean, maybe to a degree, there's some reciprocity within that relationship. And I think we should dive into some of these overlaps between Bitcoin and farming. And I wonder if you might let me kind of dive into where I think the scene kind of starts. And if you think I'm wrong,
Absolutely.
you can tell me. But as I was reading this and as I was thinking about some other things, it really struck me that we see this intersection between health, currency, and farming really occur in the 1970s, where all of these different things kind of happen. And this is sort of the genesis for how our culture in terms of health and finance has really changed. And those three moments, you have Nixon pulling us off the gold standard, which you beautifully led us up to from a historical point. So Nixon pulls us off the gold standard. We have Earl Butz, who's the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon, decides that we're going to get big or get out. And that was his exact quote, that we are going to go big in agriculture, that we are going to centralize everything, or it's time for you to get out. And that was really the death knell for the small family farm here in America and the beginning of the centralization of our food system. And so I think that's an interesting point. And then around the same time, and it's funny to kind of put all of these things together, we have the famous researcher Ancel Keys begin to, in conjunction with the media, vilify fat with his 7 countries study. And I know we've talked a lot about this on the podcast. The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz and The Case Against Sugar by Gary Taubes really, really dive deep into Ancel Keys' total effect on how we view fat. But this moment, we go off of eating animal fats and we start producing seed oils, and there begins to be more centralization in processed foods. And what I was thinking about with this is that at this point, and you can look at the different graphs for sort of human health, for human fertility, all of these things really begin their decline in the 70s. And this is correlation, not causation. So it's always important to bear that in mind. But I think we see this decline in both physical and environmental health, as well as in monetary wealth of anything other than the upper class. And one of the other arguments that I thought about making is that there's also this decline in physical and environmental wealth. And I think you can make this argument that our fecundity, that our fertility, when you're looking at both soil and human fertility, are an indicator of wealth. Like, that is our ability as an organism, to propagate and grow. 134. There you are. No, you're fine.
That was really strange.
You're totally fine. Where did I leave you?
It was just like 10 seconds ago. So yeah,
Great.
The soil and fertility.
Yeah, that is wealth, right? That's our ability to propagate as a species. It's our ability to grow, maybe not perpetually, but within a natural limit. And I think it's really interesting that we see all of these things kind of intersect in the 1970s, and we see the rise of the centralization of our food system and of farming, both, and their connection and ultimately their synthesis to become one, that our food system of processed food and farming are very tied together. You know, you see the gold standard end and you see the vilification of fat. And it's interesting.
No, I mean, you summed it up beautifully. I think everything, there's so much overlap because these are all so important.
Yeah.
But I think the 70s, I would say I think the 70s is where it really, I mean, we totally disconnected and the accelerator went full throttle. But reality, the groundwork kind of was leading up to that for definitely probably most of the 20th century. But overall, I mean, I totally agree, and why why I wrote this book is because there is so much overlap in the mindset for the things that went wrong and the mindset of the people who want to take back that into their lives and take back control. Really, that's what it comes down to. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average person could save their money. They wouldn't have to worry about it being robbed by inflation or having to play part-time investor in order for it to just grow at the rate of the increase of the money supply, and just to save up to, buy a house, raise a family, start a business, or even they could just save the money in the US dollar or whatever currency was a lot stronger back then. And then in contrast on simultaneously on the health side or the food side, they could walk into a grocery store, or they would probably be shopping more locally at their farmer's market, or just talk to their farmer. It would be, less of a conscientious thing that they could just buy the food and it would be, good for them. It would be, unprocessed, minimally processed, and they wouldn't have to really worry about being, a part-time nutritionist or a part-time, reading all these research papers, listening to all these podcasts about, it was brainless, thoughtless. They would just have money that would be savable. They would have food that would provide them proper nutrition. They would live a healthy life. They would be able to save up, raise a family. And that's how society should have been. But then we accelerated toward these trends in the 70s. It derailed.
Yeah, and I want to remark, I think it's really easy to romanticize the past, and so I don't want to get caught in that trap of over-romanticizing that it was this bucolic, it
was tough
living.
still.
It was hard.
But they had to work hard. But then, they were working in a factory, and that may have had their own health consequences, or they were a small farmer, or whatever. Say they were an accountant, that's a similar job that people have today. They were an accountant. They didn't have to worry about being, also an investor or a nutritionist, because I feel like I have the knowledge of 6 job titles or more nowadays, because, I'm researching economics, history, finances, I'm an engineer by trade, nutrition information galore, health information galore, farming. I mean, oh my gosh, it's incredible. I love all these topics, but it's really, it shouldn't be like that.
No, it shouldn't. And I think what I would argue is the difference is that there was a much greater level of transparency during that time. Mm-hmm. Maybe not ease, but there wasn't this level of obfuscation and complete manipulation, I think, of that we see now. And so you could have a little bit more trust in maybe some institutional systems in your food system. But I agree with you. I mean, we're in this position where to really get to the root cause of anything in today, whether that's illness or, what's befalling the financial system, you have to do an enormous amount of research on your own, owing to the fact that we have access to that level of research too. And so I think that's an important piece as well. With the advent of the internet, we have more.
In the 70s, we didn't.
No.
So the 80s, 90s, really we didn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And so a lot has changed. But I think that in many ways, there is a movement within agriculture to get back to the decentralization that really existed before this. And I think the regenerative agriculture movement represents that very much so, that it is antithetical to the centralization of big food and big pharma, and where those two things have combined. And so do you want to kind of talk about this intersection of decentralization between Bitcoin and beef?
Yeah, absolutely. On the the farming, the food side of things, in the 70s was a turning point, and then How this all started was because of a lot of subsidies, post-World War II, population, supporting the population boom. We're never going to be able to feed anyone. So America put on its, big old industrial hat and said, we need to do whatever we can to, just get enough calories to feed the world. And, during wartime, it's a big deal. And, obviously if the country doesn't have enough food to feed soldiers or its population, you're not going to make it. So sure, that's important short term, but then a lot of these policies, they all kind of just hung around. And then corporations started to realize this. So they realized there was all these subsidies, and farmers in corn, soy, wheat. So they started, continuing to grow more of it, and then using it in their products, right? It's really not always the fault of the corporation, but soft drinks moving from sugar to high fructose corn syrup. Everyone used to fry their French fries in like beef tallow.
Yes.
I didn't even know this till like the other week, but McDonald's did until like the early 90s.
Yeah, it was a long time.
Shocked.
Not canola oil, not some adulterated seed oil. Yeah.
But eventually, a business is like any other business, and when you work in the world of margins and growing your revenue, it's almost a no-brainer decision when something is just like a half or a fifth of the price, which we know is how it's trended with some of these low-cost ingredients because of the subsidies at first, and then they're continuing to stick around, and then just the increase of production, and these corporations, because of that, decided to exploit that, and they're the ones that are now the multi-billion-dollar corporations that have so much power and have just decided to continue to grow and really all this headway really stripped away the possibility of small farm being successful and being able to provide a living wage. So you kind of had to adopt this industrial farming method in order to keep up, in order to compete, because it's so competitive.
You figured it out.
Your neighbors are getting bought up left and right, and that's the only way to adopt it. But now we're at this point where the education is there, and the consumer is shifting their mindset because of the age of the internet, because of people like you are educating consumers as well. And there's so many in the health, nutrition, farming, food space. People are becoming more aware, and the regenerative farming movement is picking up speed. That just small scale buying local is picking up a lot of momentum. So what is the advantage of that? That's your question, is how does the decentralization play into that?
Yeah.
So the centralized food system, although it results in lower costs, it results potentially lower costs.
Will you actually unpack a little bit? I've heard you talk about subsidies, and you have a really succinct way of discussing subsidies, because I think that's really important in the aspect of exploring why it's so low cost in the centralized processed food model.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a great point, they're artificially low cost, and again, it's kind of just like a chain reaction. So these subsidies existed to just provide the calories to feed the population for a while, but then they've stuck around. But just the magnitude of the subsidies, so I write about in the book is corn, soybeans, wheat. These three crops account for about half of the total subsidies issued in the past 30 years. And since 1995, it's been over 115 billion in corn, and I can add in another $50 billion for wheat and soybean, roughly. So we're over $200 billion since the 90s, handing out corn subsidies. So what that does is it makes, and then on top of that, there's crop insurance and things for farmers. So they have a guaranteed paycheck even if a hailstorm destroys everything. So it's very intertwined. It's part of this interventionist economic governmental policy that has ruined the food system, because it not only has made it extremely cost effective. So if you go to the store, you look at how much soybean oil, canola oil, anything that's processed wheat or flour, the cost is extremely low. And it's because of these subsidies, because so many people are growing it, because it's a guaranteed paycheck. And now that's been happening for year on year on year, decade on decade. And now we have a shortage of farmers that want to kind of try something new because they're old, they're aging. The average age of the farmer in the U.S. is like in the 60s.
It's late 60s. I think it's 68.
Late 60s. Yeah, depending on the state, it could be late 60s. So it's really bad. They don't want to change their process because they're in their late 60s. They don't have the energy to overhaul to, a more regenerative or more natural farming system. And there's a lot of risk because they have a guaranteed paycheck from growing subsidized crops. And also these crops are grown monocrop, high input, high output is like this whole model that, you talked about. We're going to go big in the Secretary of Ag, right? And that system is high input, high output. And it does work in the short term. Right. It definitely works in high output, but it's really short-sighted. And that's where I see is the biggest intersection is we have made so many short-sighted decisions as a society from an agriculture standpoint, from a food system standpoint, from a monetary policy system standpoint, that has ruined our progress as a nation and society and a globe long-term. So that's what I think. There's so much intersection is being able to see past the short-term benefits, the short-term pleasure for health. And forgoing that for, a longer time horizon. And that really is important. And the reason, of course, a lot about is how monocrop agriculture, high input ruins the soil health.
Yeah.
But either way, decentralization is all about fixing that. It's all about taking some of that market share away from these large corporations that are doing it the wrong way. It's buying your source of food locally because that's more redundant to the supply chain. We have all these food issues now. I mean, sometimes I go to the grocery store, they don't even have eggs.
Sure.
Like, no eggs. When I'm up in Wyoming, I have 5 people I can call for a dozen eggs for $2.50.
Yes.
And they're farm fresh. They're fantastic. And it's a better way to give back to the community as well, and it's a form of national security in your local economy. So if we're importing all these goods from different countries, we could get into how the environmental impact of all that and how that's a whole situation. But decentralization in and of itself is providing security at the individual level, instead of putting money more into the pockets of the larger corporations, which really don't hold the interests of the individual. They only hold the interests of their revenues, their profits, and their shareholders.
Yeah, they are only accountable to their bottom line. And I think that is a really different lens than when we look at what it means to be accountable to a community, whether that's your immediate community that you're feeding and building a local economy within, or if it's the community of bacteria and microbes and fungi in the soil, or if that's the community of humans that are building a more sustainable lives for themselves and their children here on this planet. And so, and it's interesting, you touched on something that was a big question for me, which is both Bitcoin and regenerative ways of eating meat require this big shift in consumer values from short-term to long-term thinking, whether that's in the generation of health or soil or wealth. And so how do we shift those consumer values?
Yeah, it's probably the hardest thing, right? I mean, and this becomes, prevalent with everyday lifestyle habits. Short-term pleasure might be going out and partying, having a great night, but really what's the long-term detriment to your health if you're doing that often and disrupting your circadian rhythm, putting toxins in your body? And in terms of Bitcoin, right, people always complain about the volatility of Bitcoin, even though it's, a 13-year-old asset, which is completely disrupting, monetary policy, and it's really perhaps, the greatest invention of the 21st century. if you have a 5-year time horizon, the return on Bitcoin is absurd, and it has been, and it's, you know, been the best performing asset class since the, you know, 2010, 2015, and 2020 still, even with the latest, you know, drop in all markets. But really, if you just have a time horizon of 5 to 10 years and you understand the value of scarcity, which now more people do more than ever because of inflation, it's a no-brainer decision. I mean, it's really that simple. You don't have to have your entire portfolio in it, but it's not the same as an investment. It's having sound money that won't inflate, and if anything, it's just going to continue to increase in value because of the scarcity, and the more and more people that figure it out will, of course, drive up the price. So if you just change that time horizon to, you know, 5 to 10 years instead of a couple months from now, which is, I don't know if it's the digital age. I think people really get stressed out when they see, you know, everyone becoming rich and famous on social media. They're traveling to these great places, and, you know, everyone's just so fit. Even though half those people are on steroids, especially in the, you know, the male fitness community, that they just, you know, they want the health pill, they want the magic pill, they want the magic stock, the magic investment that's going to get them rich in 2 weeks and get them ripped in, you know, a month. But it doesn't work like that. I mean, we know that results come from consistency. And if that's, you know, in farming, if that's in working out and exercising, if that's in investing, Warren Buffett, for example, that's literally all he preaches, even though he hates Bitcoin. He's also 90 years old, but we'll give him the merit of that. And it's consistency. It's changing your time horizon. You know, we underestimate what we can accomplish in 5 to 10 years, but way overestimate what we can accomplish in 1 year. And that's really what's important. So it's this whole shift in mindset. And I think we have too many people that, you know, they're kind of like halfway in, you know, they try and, you know, do the diet. That's why the diet culture is so toxic, is they try and do the diet. They, you know, they live the healthy lifestyle. You know, they save money or something like that, for example, for a short period of time. And then they're doing it unsustainably, and then they go off the rails. And the cycle repeats. And it's an issue. So if you convince someone to change their lifestyle for the better, for good, but you do it in a less, you know, forceful manner and kind of feed them the education bits and lead by example, I think that's a much more effective way. And, you know, for money, you kind of have to show them the way slowly. And that's why, you know, I wrote this book, is because you have to understand the fundamentals. You have to understand how we got here, what's wrong with the current systems, and what are the solutions. And then you can be able to make a more informed decision and hopefully change your lifestyle habits for the better, for the long term.
I love that. And I think that really speaks to what is necessary, is this giant shift in perspective, right? That it's not a diet, it's just a change in lifestyle. And the long-term reward is health, is fertility, is joy. And those are, you can't put a value on that return over a diet pill. And so I think that there's a lot of overlap in terms of the perspective shift that it takes to go to buying local food, to buying regenerative meat, and to looking at financial health and wealth over the course of the long term. And it's that idea of a health span versus lifespan, right? Like I want a long time where I am healthy, and not a life where my health begins to degrade at 55 and I have another 20 years of low quality of life and pills. Yeah. I want that long health span, not just a lifespan. There's another little overlap I kind of wanted to explore with you, and I think that's the vilification of beef and Bitcoin within the media, oftentimes from a really similar lens, oftentimes through their impact on the environment, which is maybe a deeply misunderstood issue on both sides.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, the book, is laid out and, introducing these topics. What are they? Why does it matter? And then literally writes part 2 of the book is, the criticisms of Bitcoin and beef, because for some reason, I mean, these two are just really popular to just bash in the mainstream media. Politicians, the billionaires love to just talk smack about all the people in power, really. I mean, it's like they're a threat. I guess that's a form of flattery. That's how I take it. But yeah, no, a lot of overlaps. I think definitely touch upon the big one is the environmental piece. So, Bitcoin is often touted as, consuming as much energy as like a Scandinavian country. And what does that even mean? And what it comes down to, again, for both Bitcoin and the beef piece is this is highly technical information. If you don't understand how energy consumption works, how the Bitcoin mining network is set up, what that means in the grand scheme of things, or how farming works, how carbon sequestration works, what does methane mean in terms of gas characteristics compared to CO2? So we could talk a little bit about that, but overall it's very technical information. So if you're very, high level or even just reading headlines of information, it's very easy to paint a negative image for these topics, but what does it actually mean? So, Bitcoin consumes, the network over, 150 terawatt hours of energy a year, which is equivalent to small countries. But is that a lot? Actually, global Bitcoin mining consumes less than 0.2% of the world's total energy production. What does that mean? I mean, that's a really small number if you think about it. How much energy does the current financial banking system, consume, or how much was consumed to put up every retail bank location in the world? This is a potential future monetary system, and it does consume a fair amount of energy, but in reality, money is extremely important. So the fact that it's only 0.2% of the world's energy production, not a lot.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think gets lost in both the conversation of beef and Bitcoin, which I can't speak to really, but is this idea of energy accounting, that we don't look thoroughly at what the alternatives mean. What does the institutional banking system look like in terms of the amount of energy that it takes to build physical banking locations and to go and get the materials for those physical banking locations? They say a piece of plywood goes around the world 3 times before it lands in its ultimate location. Like, what kind of energy expenditure is going into operating all those physical locations, all those ATMs, all the way back? And this is a thought experiment that you can also do within beef and farming. And I talk about this a lot in the comparison of plant-based meat versus regenerative beef, or even just conventional beef. What does it take in terms of fossil fuels, to fertilize that monocrop, to build those massive combines, and to harvest all of those things? How much energy does it take out of a whole ecosystem? How much death is built into that system that we don't see? Yep. What about on the processing end of things, once it goes in and it's being processed on massive machinery and warehouses and packaged and all of these different things, that you can go into this deep energy accounting that really changes your view of what that, 0.2% really represents in relationship to banks.
Yeah. No, totally. And I mean, that's a deeper view, right? I mean, but to be honest, I think people they're not going to understand that, right? So I like to start at high level and then bring them deeper. So same with beef too. So yeah, high level, 0.2% of global energy. It's really nothing. I mean, I think, I've compared in the book, and I've seen a lot of data that I'm going to read is from the Bitcoin Mining Council report from last quarter. And, they say, holiday, Christmas lights, if that were, a country would also be on the same, it's a little bit less. It's like 75% of Bitcoin's total energy consumption. All right. Should, no one put up Christmas lights? That's just an example. That's just absurd. Like no one's dragging, holiday lights through, the media as, this is ruining the planet. Elizabeth Warren is not tweeting that this is causing climate change, which is absolutely absurd. So that's a starting point, right? 0.2%. That's nothing in the grand scheme of things. And it is a very important network, and potentially, our future monetary policy or reserve currency. I mean, who knows what can happen? And that amount of energy will continue to increase. But here's the other thing that people don't really understand is that the majority of Bitcoin is mined with sustainable or renewable energy. So the estimates are, they vary. They've been as high as like 70+% and as low as like 30 to 40% in terms of the energy sustainable mix. But right now, the Bitcoin Mining Council's latest report is saying it's somewhere roughly around 58%. And, in the book, I estimated the real number is probably just above 50%. So that means over half of the Bitcoin is being mined with renewable or sustainable energy. That a lot of it is additive to the grid, and this is a positive. So not only do I think that Bitcoin mining is not bad for the environment or bad for the grid, it's actually the best thing that's happened to energy consumption and energy production probably in the past, 100 years. And that's because it's innovation, because in order for a miner to be successful, it needs basically free or very low cost energy. You probably need to be less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour to be successful at Bitcoin mining, and probably not even be competitive at those rates.
It's a business.
It's a business. And many of them you'll see, and the sell-offs, the reason why it is volatile is because these miners are often need to sell their Bitcoin when the price drops so much, because they just don't have, the money to keep on mining. Because the energy cost is, you have your hardware cost up front, and then you have your daily energy cost. So 5 cents or less a kilowatt hour, you're getting that absolutely nowhere in the world, commercially or residentially, pretty much. So that's where, renewable energy comes in. If you have, a wind farm or solar energy, once you have that upfront hardware cost put in, you have free energy theoretically, right? But what people don't talk about is that a lot of this Bitcoin mining is done dynamically, and it's done with otherwise wasted energy. So Bitcoin miners are the most flexible consumers of energy, unlike common industrial loads like air conditioning units, or consumer loads, air conditioning units, just lighting, residential buildings. That stuff has to happen, right? People need air conditioning in their homes. They need to turn the lights on. They need to heat their homes, etc. But Bitcoin miners, what they have the ability to is to turn off and on at a moment's notice. So what people don't understand is that the grid is like a trading desk. It's like the stock market, because prices of energy are fluctuating constantly. And oftentimes in demand surges and supply shortages, they go extremely high. So think of like a classic, hot day in Texas. They'll actually tell you to not turn your AC below like 75 degrees, because they straight up just don't have the energy to support it. And it's really, a daily fluctuation and trying to manage that load. It's really complicated stuff, but it's dynamic. And the opposite of that is on a super windy day in West Texas or, Eastern Wyoming or California, super sunny day, prices will go very low or potentially even negative, because generation sources have nowhere to offload this energy, and they need to get rid of it. So prices will go extremely low or negative. And that's where Bitcoin miners can scoop up extremely, low price or free energy. And that's where they take advantage of it. And if it's a super high cost energy day, they might curtail their loads and turn them off.
It's an incentive.
And not mine any Bitcoin. So they're really filling in the gaps of the energy demand and energy supply. And they're actually, the perfect consumer of energy, and often using, these highly variable renewable sources, because that's a problem with, solar and wind is, they're super dependent on the weather conditions. And, but on a day where there's excess, that energy becomes basically free. So that's the thing. And then otherwise, or other than that, there's also, stranded energy. This one region in China, for example, during the wet season and it's a pretty rural area of China, they had like up to 40% of the mining power globally for 3 months was in this region, because they get so much rain that the hydroelectric power generated is like multiple times what is needed in that local area. They don't have the infrastructure to send it to the major metropolitan areas of, Beijing or Shanghai. Bitcoin miners, all you need is, a local data center and an internet connection, and you can mine that Bitcoin right there on the spot for little to no cost of energy, and you're not wasting the energy either, which is brilliant. And they're doing this, natural gas flaring. There's countries doing it with geothermal. It's really incredible.
Fascinating.
So not only is it really a small percentage of the energy production, it's mostly sustainable, highly innovative, and it's actually protecting our grid and improving the fundamental dynamics of how our grid works. And it's really exciting. I mean, I'm a nerd for like the power grid stuff, and I'm excited to dive more into it. But it's really crazy how innovative and, creative these Bitcoin miners are becoming. So I would say if you think that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment or bad for the power grid, you are so misinformed on what's actually happening. And the innovation is extremely encouraging to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'd make the same argument for beef, right? And as you were talking, I couldn't help think about, you used the term flexible consumers of energy. And I was thinking about both soil microbes and what flexible consumers of energy that they are as they sequester carbon deep in the soil table. But also thinking about, I'm actually looking out my window and I can see my goats, who I actually consider to be incredibly flexible consumers of energy, as browsers rather than grazers. And I think that's really interesting, to be able to better utilize the power grid in a way that makes sense in a decentralized manner.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really, I'm excited to see how this continues to evolve. But yeah, that just shows, if you really understand grid dynamics and look into the data that mining companies are putting out, and understand that they literally can't be profitable unless they have cheap or free energy. Where are they getting that from? Renewable sources.
Yeah.
So that's level one understanding that, hopefully our politicians become more educated and don't regulate this or something, because that would be a very, sad to see. But
on both sides. I mean, just this week in
beef.
Canada, we saw Ireland
New
is
Zealand too.
New Zealand, Ireland are talking about taxing methane emissions from beef. They're talking about putting a health label on beef in Canada because of the saturated fat. We're really facing down a different level of considering this, and I know you have. I actually really love your perspective on carbon and methane. And and since we've kind of talked about the Bitcoin mining energy, do you want to talk about carbon and methane emissions in beef?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a perspective that a lot of people in the health farming space, they know a lot about beef emissions. Your audience, I'm sure you have talked about this at length. They understand soil health, negative carbon beef, white oak pastures. This all exists. So how I like to start it is a similar way. Really beef emissions are, probably at worst 4 to 5% of global annual carbon emissions. But what most people don't understand, and of course that's a whole natural process that's been going on for hundreds of years, and we've had all these wild ruminants, bison, elk, pronghorns, deer, etc. for, before we had cattle. So in reality, that's the only source of emissions that has been around. But when you realize how they calculate these emissions, you are open to a whole new perspective. So all these emissions are calculated in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, because that's, the biggest greenhouse gas, and it's easy for them to base it in one common, form of emissions. So as you mentioned, and as most people know, ruminants such as cattle, sheep, goats, they emit methane, through natural enteric emission fermentation process when, they're upcycling the nutrients from grass and turning it into very nutrient-dense food, which is a fantastic process. So methane, in order to get methane into carbon dioxide emissions, they have a scaling factor, which is called the global warming potential metric, GWP. So all the regulating bodies, EPA, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is kind of the biggest one globally, they have a global warming potential for each gas outside of carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide would just be one. And methane, their global warming potential for methane is 28. It ranges, from 28 to 36. So that means for each kilogram of methane that a cattle emits, it will be multiplied by up to a 36 scaling factor because of the global warming potential. Why is that? That's huge, right? 36x. So, if you took the 4 to 5% of global emissions that's attributed to cattle and divided that by, 30, you'd be at a lot smaller number, less than 1%, less than 0.5%. Yeah. And, but why is that, So methane and carbon dioxide are totally different gases from a fundamental characteristic standpoint. So carbon dioxide is what's called a stock gas, and it has an atmospheric lifetime of hundreds of years, 300 to 1,000 years. So it has a much longer term impact. So that means any CO2 we're putting up in the atmosphere will stay up there for potentially up to 1,000 years.
Unless we draw it down with regenerative agriculture.
Unless we sequester it. Yes, exactly. And methane is what's called a flow gas. So it's a much shorter lived gas, but it has higher energy absorption when it is in the atmosphere. So the lifespan of methane in the atmosphere is typically around 10 to 12 years. So we're talking about, potentially 30x shorter lifespan. Yeah. So unfortunately, the global warming potentials don't really play that into effect accurately or fairly, according to, some of the leading researchers who are kind of open-minded. Dr. Frank Mitloehner from UC Berkeley is one of them. And people like him have stated that the global warming potential from the IPCC and the EPA, which this 28 to 36 number is based on 100 years of time, and it says it does not consider the lifetime of carbon dioxide enough, and it unfairly is scaled against methane. And that's also becomes more problematic when you start thinking about green tax or carbon taxes as well. So researchers from Oxford University actually came up with a different calculation system called the GWP star or GWP asterisk. And basically, they take into account that, shorter lifespan of methane. And when you compare that to temperature modeling, so I have this in the book, but when you compare each metric, the GWP, the standard one, and then the GWP star, and compare it to temperature modeling data, the GWP star performs much more accurately. And why is that? That's because methane, since it has such a short lifespan, it reaches like a steady state much faster. So if you want to take into account like cattle, if you have, 150 head cattle operation, but you don't change that number for 10 to 12 years, you always have, 150 herd of cattle. You're not really, after 10 to 12 years, you're not adding any additional methane to the atmosphere. You're kind of reaching that steady state point a lot faster. However, under a lot of these Paris Agreement, climate, carbon tax that are proposed, that will not be taken into consideration, and they'll just be continued to be taxed even after that steady state time is reached. So if you inherit, a large ranch or something, and you're really not increasing the herd, you are going to be totally unfairly treated by any of these taxes or something like that. It's going to make from a policy,
and it's going to make a big impact on a very small margins business in the first place. And
exactly
that's as a farmer and as a butcher, I mean, oftentimes you're looking at something between 1% and 2.5% margins, and that's tight. It's penny's business.
And what's really interesting is in the United States, the cattle herd has decreased about 30% since the 70s.
Well, yeah, they're bad. They have saturated fat. Ansel Keys told us so.
That's right. So in reality, the carbon footprint due to the cattle herd in the United States has played probably no impact to recent temperature rises.
Yes.
Does it have an impact? Absolutely. But it's that delta that really matters, that change over time.
Yes.
And after 10, 12 years, because of the lifespan, that it totally is different than carbon dioxide from an industrial power plant, which can potentially stay up in the atmosphere for, hundreds of years. And this is level one, right? We haven't even talked about the positive things, right? That regenerative farming, carbon sequestration, I read about, potential hydroxyl groups that can sequester methane that comes from, different ruminant animals as well recently. So
interesting.
The benefit, this is a new area that I'm researching. Methane carbon sequestration is a whole new topic, and the natural methane cycle is not talked about. The natural carbon cycle is, but how does methane have a specific part in that? Because it's totally different gases, right? So we're talking about we need more accurate modeling, and this is apparently a hot debate in the scientific community, as it should be. But I just fear that because the IPCC, they have such large influence, and you can see how heavily plant-based their agenda is in all these governing bodies, that it's really a shame. And hopefully we can fight back with real education, real science that is fair.
I think it's also important to recognize that within the plant-based model, you can centralize profits, that you have a food conglomerate, this massive piece of control. And I mean, even Cargill is one of the biggest investors, and one of them, I never remember if it's Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, you have Bill Gates. And so you can really centralize the profits to benefit the few in terms of that. But within regenerative agriculture, and I would actually argue within conventional livestock agriculture as well, you have a wider distribution of those profits across more people, and it is not centralized and owned by a single or a handful of entities. And I think that one of the biggest aspects of decentralization is taking the profits and the control from the few and redispersing them throughout the many.
Yeah. I mean, it's Cargill, JBS. You realize, why are all these meat packers, getting into plant-based foods?
It's about money.
Why do you think they don't care about the food? They just care about increasing their revenue and making more money. And Bill Gates investing, and when you have more inputs and you have more of a factory style setting, more ingredients, you need to build more factories, or lab made meat, you need to build labs that create meat. There's more money to be made, but it is such a waste of money to put up all these things and source all these ingredients, and that's really the main issue. So it's never been about the health of the environment's always just been about profits.
I completely agree. And one of the, I like to put things through two sniff tests: the evolutionary biology sniff test, which we can put the entire emissions model of ruminants through, as well as, any of the aspects of saturated animal fats playing a role in human health and diet, and the who stands to profit from this sniff test. And I think between those two, you can often uncover a lot of obfuscation that's happening in the greater realms of centralization. And so I think that's important to note, that I do think that regenerative farming puts more money back in the hands of the people. I have some deeper concerns about how difficult it is as a business, how tight margins it is as a business. Mm-hmm. And actually one of the questions I came in here with is like, do you think that there's an entry point where we can use Bitcoin or cryptocurrency as a way of creating, and this is tough, but let's try it out, creating stability for farmers in a low margin business, that they're holding this asset class that is appreciating, and it's sort of hedging them against the volatility, and this is where it's tough because I think right now Bitcoin is pretty volatile, the volatility within the farming business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I think the biggest hurdle, right, to switching over to regenerative farming in general is, how much money will it cost, and am I going to be able to sustain that, pay my mortgage, and actually market? So there's a lot of things I think that go into this, and there's some people totally doing it right. So first, before we get into Bitcoin, I mean, selling direct to your customer.
Yes.
You're getting way more money.
Yes, you are.
Probably.
I know,
right?
I know, because I'm a little screwed on that front in the butcher shop business, and I've spoken a lot about how I would not open up another butcher shop, and that this is the part of the problem, is that we need that direct to consumer model.
Yeah, but even, I mean, a local butcher shop is still nothing compared to, the standard, processors, a rancher is selling wholesale, then there's distribution, and then there's the processing, the distribution, the packing and all that. Really, I mean, I don't know what the accurate percentage is, but I think the rancher's probably getting 70 to 80% taken out from what the end customer is actually paying at the grocery store. They're getting cents on the dollar.
Yeah, so in general, in the United States, just to speak to this, on average, between 7 and 11 cents of every dollar that you spend at the grocery store goes back to the farmer. So you're about right. About 90% gets taken out. And so that's your loss. I know that at Western Daughters, at my butcher shop, 50 cents of every dollar that you spend goes directly back to the farmer, which makes it a really difficult,
it's fantastic,
and a very difficult business model.
Yeah. But either way, I think, so that's step one. And I think a lot of these farms have figured out how to do, online marketing, social media, and transparency is the other great things, right? You can literally just, have videos online of your cattle, your goats, your chickens, and people
visitors
love that. And
you can go visit.
And they will pay extra for that transparency, for that honesty, for that interaction.
Yes.
So you can charge a slight premium because it's higher quality. If you figure out how to do a direct to consumer model, obviously, processing, transportation still probably hurdles to figure that out. Those are two major steps. And then if you have a savings in a currency that is going to hold its value or appreciate value over time, you have that backup money to continue to allow your operation to maybe not only scale, but scale and prosper, and then reach more people, or, have a higher quality operation, or try new things. You'll have more flexibility. You'll be able to survive a bad year if you have that reserve currency that is sitting and appreciating, as opposed to a dollar that is depreciating. So yes, I think, and that's not only goes for farming, it goes for anybody who wants to start a small business. And it's really an issue because Right now, what people do is they take out a lot of debt. They take out a lot of loans to be able to do these things, to be able to start a business, to be able to, have a farming operation. So they're indebted. And when you become over leveraged in debt and you don't have the cash flow to pay for it because something goes wrong, the bank owns you. So that's the problem. And, people don't just save in US dollars. They take out the loans and then they pay the loans back slowly, if they can. And that it really puts you in a really bad situation with the bank and with your loan if something goes wrong. So instead, if you have an asset that like Bitcoin, which you're slowly just putting small profits into over time, and that continues to appreciate over, against the US dollar over, a 5 to 10 to 15, 20 year period, you're going to be able to have way more flexibility and improve your operation and keep it going. I mean, maybe but I would guess a lot of farmers fail. I know that farmers that go bankrupt most often are ones that inherit their land because they don't actually know how to run it from a business perspective. Yeah. It's like a hobby thing. So obviously you have to be committed on that.
I don't know that percentage off the top of my head, but yes, a lot of farmers fail, and even within the regenerative space, it's a hard business. And I think I think you just spoke to something that's so vital. We've lost some of that generational knowledge of how to do this. And so a lot of the class of people that are entering regenerative farming I'm from Denver proper. I'm from the city. I didn't grow up doing this. And so there's a steep learning curve. And when you couple that with the learning curve of how to run and maintain a business, that gets even steeper. And so we're faced with that, and with a generation of mentors that are either not interested in regenerative farming or are getting too old to teach it.
Yep. And it goes back to what I said earlier, right? If you have that opportunity to just put your savings in Bitcoin and knowing it will appreciate, as opposed to being farmer by day, figuring out how to, take out the right loans, or part-time investor by night. You're just not going to have the time to do that effectively, or you're going to have to pay someone else to do it, which is another expense. But yeah, overall, that's definitely important. And then the last thing, which I've seen more of, and I've been talking to, his name's Texas Slim down in Texas. He's doing what's called a beef initiative, where he's setting up a system to pay your local ranchers for their beef and meat in Bitcoin.
Interesting. Okay. I'll check that out.
Incredible.
And we'll put a show note in there.
Yeah. The beef initiative is what it's called. These guys are pretty big on Twitter. So definitely check them out. I'm going to go down to, they're having a conference in Colorado, Western Colorado, I believe, in Campbell in July. So that's something that maybe we need to scale to a national level. Is one is and it starts with the education of, the consumer. Yes. Why should they get Bitcoin? Why is it, matter? And then rewarding your, local farmers and ranchers for providing such a valuable service of nutrient dense foods to you and your family by paying them in Bitcoin. So that's really something that's really cool that's going on. And I realized, after writing this book, I started talking to people, and I'm like, wow, it's crazy how many people are interested in the same thing. And it all boils down to that mindset of, and farmers and ranchers are like the easiest people to convince about Bitcoin, because they're like, I don't, I own this money, this is hard money that I own. The bank can't tell me what to do with it. And, I have sole control over it. They're like, yeah, that's, that sounds awesome. Like, sign me up.
Yes. And I think farmers also tend to have a more long-term lens.
Yes.
And I think that's that mindset is already embedded in that industry.
Yes, exactly. So if anything, the hardest part might be to get Bitcoiners to spend their Bitcoin. But if it's rewarding, something as great as, your local farmer and rancher, I think they'll be open to that. But that's just an example of how we can kind of get creative, spread the buzz around both, having regenerative farms, buying locally, and using sound money to do it.
That's great.
It's great.
I love that. I know we've been going for a while now. I have a couple of just kind of off the rails questions if you're down for that. But
I'm up for it.
Before that, is there any major things that we missed that you want to make sure to communicate?
No, I don't think so. I mean, overall, right, my book, I wrote it about the fundamentals, the introduction of Bitcoin and beef. It's like two separate kind of timelines in the first half of the book, and then it converges at the point of decentralization after, the common criticisms are covered. And really, I mean, it starts with, here's what you need to know fundamentally about these items. You need to have an education to be able to criticize or defend something. So I want to give people factual firepower. I mean, there's over 300 sources in the book. There's a lot of facts. Like we talked to some about subsidies and this methane stuff. Yeah. I want you to have this resource to be able to defend something that you believe in, or I want to convince you that these are things that are worth fighting for and worth believing in. And the convergence at the end of decentralization kind of just goes into how much manipulation there is with the large corporations and governments through, subsidies are one thing, lobbying, media influence, who's paying who. You can look all this stuff up and it's shocking. And once you realize that everybody is, paying everybody to say what they want to say, then you'll realize soon that it doesn't matter about left or right. It matters about, or vegan or carnivore. It matters about fighting the system. So we need to act together. We need to put aside diet wars. We need to put aside political ideologies, and we need to work together on fighting what's right for the individual. And these large centralized systems are really stripping away our freedom and liberty as citizens.
I agree. And I couldn't agree more. And I think not just at the individual level, but at the level of the community, that this is worth finding bridges instead of finding how we're different and how angry this faction is at this faction. And I think that that's one of my big goals with this is to build more bridges. And so I love that. I have a couple of burning questions that I've been dying to ask somebody, and so I'm just going to put you through
Let's
this.
Hear it.
I have this question, and I think this came up a couple of times throughout the podcast about volatility, that Bitcoin is at this time a pretty volatile asset class. And I think when I look at a traditional market model, I see volatility as being tied to historically geo and socio-political tides, supply and demand, consumer behavior. But what is Bitcoin tied to in terms of its fluctuations? And we just saw a huge fluctuation this week. And where does that belief that this is going to be stable over time come from?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's definitely multifaceted. So let me start with the first one it's very important is, if you look at the history of Bitcoin, it traded, under $1 a coin for a while, and then, it was in the tens of dollars range and spiked up to, $300 or so. I don't have the chart up, and then crashed down, under, $20, but it was such a small asset class for a long time. So just recently, it kind of became in the big boys class of, $1 trillion asset class, and it's below that now again. Recently. So when something is, a smaller asset class, back in, 2015 to 2016, and then in 2017, it went from, being worth like 1,000 a coin or below 1,000 to about 19 to 20,000 at the peak. When something is smaller as a total market cap, it's just easier to move in terms of, when a large investor steps into the game, or a big surge of retail. So the cycle in 2017 was fully driven by retail investors. So all this hype around it, and everyone and their mom, sister, brother are buying like a couple $100 worth, and you multiply that by, you know, a million people, a couple million people, and the market cap is pretty low. It can really drive the price up. And it's a new technology, right? It has such a small history. So something that's new, the market cap is pretty low in the grand scheme of things. You know, it's easier to drive the price up. And a lot of it was, you know, a hype train for a while. People didn't really understand. There was no large institutional investors in the game. So that's what kind of drives the volatility up from, you know, the earlier perspective. And then also, and that's kind of tampered over time. So you'll see from 2017 to 2018, we went from 20,000 to down to $3,000 a coin. So that's over, you know, it's dropping over a sixth in price. Right now, we went from, you know, 70,000 to 20,000, or 69,000 to 20,000, and that is a little over a third drop in price. And we may go lower, I don't know, but it's definitely the volatility is definitely tampering or getting smaller over time, and that's because it's becoming a larger asset class. So from that perspective, you will see decreased volatility over time because you have people who will absolutely just refuse to sell their Bitcoin. I mean, most long-term holders are just accumulating more on these drops.
Yeah.
And the more and more people buy into the fundamentals of why it's such a superior form of money, the less people will sell at the time of fear. And right now,
sure, makes perfect.
The reason why the reason why we rose so high since 2020 is because the expansion of the money supply. You know, all assets, S&P 500 and NASDAQ, they all went up absurd amounts since the COVID crash in March of 2020. And now, because of the Fed tightening and rising interest rates, it's going back down. And Bitcoin, although it is uncorrelated with traditional markets at times, when the policy of, you know, the monetary policy is affecting everything like it is right now, it will be heavily correlated during these times. So it still has, you know, a lot of reason to follow the traditional markets because a lot of the traditional markets are fully based on the monetary policy from the Fed. And that, you know, that could, the more and more people that get into it, the more that will change as well. And overall, the correlation to traditional markets will likely go down over time. And it's still lower than any other asset class, really, although recently has been heavily correlated. So that's one thing.
Interesting.
Or two things. And then the third thing is the miners that we talked about. So the miners, they're kind of like farmers. I mean, they have a pretty small margin for operating, and in certain times, because, you know, that volatility is so high still, that when the price drops to kind of where it is right now, and there's, you know, people often use mining kind of break-even points to predict the bottoms of Bitcoin cycles, because they can kind of calculate based on energy cost, based on hardware cost, what it takes to, you know, mine one Bitcoin on an average price basis. And once it gets closer to that point, which we're getting close to that now, miners will be forced to sell the Bitcoin that they have mined in order to keep going, or else they will go bankrupt.
Sure.
So, you know, an efficient or, you know, a smart miner might try and sell maybe more at the top, or they might just be holding. And Bitcoin is what they have. They don't, you know, they mine Bitcoin, so that's the money they have. They're not going to convert it to dollars, or they have to convert it to dollars to get actual money to pay for other things, I should say. So that's the other thing that would be driving volatility in the space. So yes, it is high, but in reality, all other markets are pretty much just based on, you know, the monetary policy at this stage, right? So is Bitcoin, and these markets are, you know, so old, and they have so much money invested into them that it's a totally different comparison. And
Yeah.
like I said, I think as it goes on, you will definitely see a decreased volatility. But if you have that longer time horizon of, I would say even 4+ years, you're always in the green. So I wouldn't worry about it. If you're just trying to invest in it for a short profit, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons anyway.
Yeah.
But those are some important dynamics that are affecting the volatility.
That was perfect, and that really answered something. I just have one more kind of strange question. But then you should read Charles Eisenstein's Sacred Economics, and we should have a different conversation about this idea of monetary and financial systems as ecosystems and kind of mirroring nature. But one of my questions is actually kind of embedded in that is this idea of hoarding. And one of the things that you said when you talked about farmers is getting them to spend the Bitcoin. And one of the things that I considered here is, 10% of the gold that's out there is used in electronics and the rest is hoarded. It's literally dug out of the ground and then put back into vaults under the ground. And I think that has created a lot of that wealth disparity where very few own the majority and it's all tucked away and inaccessible. Are we doing that with Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough conversation. I would say in general, first off, that a lot of the people who did get in very early may have a large amount of Bitcoin relative to people who are in it now, but a lot of them have lost it along the way, traded it or sold it. I mean, there's not a lot of people who straight up just bought it in like 2012 and just haven't sold it since then. And honestly, if they do still have it, like props to them for still holding it through like 80% plus turndowns. You could say they saw the value and, they're fully, they got diamond hands. That's what we say. So if they have that much conviction that Bitcoin is like the future of, money and it's here to stay, good on them. But there's not a lot of people like that, to be honest. I would say, if anything, the problem is that a lot of these large exchanges have where you can buy Bitcoin. They have a large amount, of course. But as we're seeing kind of recently, some of these exchanges are over leveraged and becoming insolvent.
Yeah.
So
I think we saw that with Celsius this week.
Yes, exactly. So you're up to date on that. So you can see they're going to make mistakes. Definitely not all these guys are going to be around in 10 plus years either, because they get greedy, they make mistakes, and there's no U.S. government to bail you out of you being over leveraged in crypto, which is good. It's a cleansing of the market. That's why bear markets and volatility are good, because it flushes out weak hands. It flushes out people who are only there to get rich quick, and it flushes out people who are over leveraged. And you can make the same argument for any recession. And if you try and prevent a recession by printing more money, it's really doing a disservice to the entire country, because you're just bailing out businesses who are operating way above their means. And
it is artificially suppressing inflation in the same way that subsidies artificially suppress the true cost of food. Like they are one and the same. And I think that is also an interesting parallel between these two things.
Yeah, exactly. So that's perfectly summed up, and you get it. But so are there a few entities that do have a large amount of holdings in Bitcoin? Yes. I would expect that to, become more dispersed over time.
That's
and
interesting.
There's always going to be, more people who have a large amount of the supply of some money. But there's also been a large amount of Bitcoin that's been lost. People have, passed away or lost their keys to their wallet. There is people who are hoarding it because they have such a strong conviction. I think there's absurd percentage of wallets that have just bought Bitcoin and never moved it, never sold it, nothing. So if anything, that should make you more bullish on it, because out of that 19 million, maybe a couple million are lost forever, and then maybe another 10 million are in the hands of people who straight up are not going to ever sell it or trade it for anything unless maybe it's helping out a local farmer, but that means the supply is actually way lower than it really is, the real supply.
Yeah.
So in terms of wealth, but in terms of wealth gap, you bring up a very, very good point on wealth gap, because I mean, right now, the wealth gap is larger than it's ever been in terms of the US dollar. Because
we just saw the emptying of it. Like, we just over the last 2 years saw, the complete gutting of...
But why is that? It's because inflation is really a tax on the lower class and the middle class that doesn't have the majority of their net worth in assets. Wealthy people, they probably, even if you're a multi-billionaire, you probably got at most like $1 million in cash, probably less.
Yeah,
in your bank
liquidity
account.
is low.
It's low. That's why it's hilarious when people, just go at these billionaires for paying more taxes and stuff like that, because they don't have, like, all their money is in stock and real estate. So it's not liquid. But because the US dollar is not backed by anything and they continue to increase the supply of it, people with wealth have to put their money into things that are going to appreciate with the increase in money supply. So they're just trying to preserve their wealth. So all their money is tied up in assets like real estate, like investments, stocks, and the person who's living paycheck to paycheck, they don't have any money. They don't have the means to invest a lot of money into assets because they're just trying to survive. And when inflation is, double-digit percentage, they're really hurting. And they probably aren't getting a 10% raise at their job because that never happens. And, corporations are over-leveraged and they don't have the cash flow to give every one of their employees an inflation-adjusted raise.
I can't do it at my mom and pop shop.
So that's really the wealth gap is continuing to widen. Probably, and it's just going to cause more social tension. We've already seen that it's probably only going to get worse. So Bitcoin, anybody can buy Bitcoin. You could buy $100 worth. And if you were early, you could have been broke as hell. But if you believed in it and you put, $1,000 into it in 2015 and you hold it to 2030, you are probably going to be very well off. So yeah, there is going to be a gap between the large holders and the smaller holders, but there is this opportunity, and it may be the biggest redistribution of wealth that's ever happened because there's no, secret club. There's no minimal investment, which all these angel investors, these VC guys, it's all BS. You have to have 10 grand, 100 grand to, be part of their cool kids club and make millions. There's none of that. I mean, you just need to, you could buy $5 a day for the next 5 years, and anybody can do that probably. And you might be, in the top 5% of Bitcoin holders in 20 years. Who knows?
Fascinating.
So
thank you.
That's what I would say.
Thank you.
It's not perfect, but
of course not.
The opportunity is there
and
if you want to pursue it.
I appreciate you sharing your perspective on this as somebody who's coming to this with no idea. That was thank you for entertaining those two questions. I'm excited to circle back after you read this book. But last question that I ask every guest, what does it mean for you to lay the groundwork?
For me, and I think it ties back to kind of why I'm so passionate about these topics and why I wrote this book is it really can make a substantial difference on the quality of people's lives if they have the education about how our food and health systems are actually functioning, how our monetary system functions, and how they can make changes in their life to be on the good side of that or the providing end in terms of reaping the benefits of what our bodies are capable of, what our earth and environment is capable of, what our community is capable of. And these two things, money and health, are probably the most two important things in your life. And unfortunately, you do need money to some degree to be happy. You don't need a lot of it, but you need a money that is going to work for you and not against you. And that's where Bitcoin provides solace to people, because they have an opportunity to just save in an appreciating asset, as opposed to working with an asset that's only going to hurt them in the long run. So laying the groundwork for me is putting out education, connecting with like-minded individuals like yourself is really rewarding. And I hope to, continue to do this and give back to the community and educate as many people as possible so they can have a higher quality life for themselves and their friends and family.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? We'll have full links in the show notes to socials, but where can people find you the most?
Yeah. So I have a personal Instagram at Tristan_health.
Great.
Just post, insights to my daily living lifestyles. And then also have a separate Instagram for the book at Bitcoin and Beef. And then also stepping up my game on Twitter, because that's where a lot of the Bitcoiners live. That's where all the Bitcoiners are, and that's Bitcoin and _beef. The logos are on there for the book. Awesome. And the book is out now on Amazon, so please check it out. I think it'll really be a tool for you as well if you're already familiar with these topics, and if not, you'll definitely learn some things. I know I did researching and writing it. And please leave a review as well, because that helps the Amazon algorithm. Yep. And hopefully we can just educate as many people as possible and continue to build a community here.
I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah. Thank you.